It's only shown once, and it may take 42 minutes to get there, but at least we do get our franchise staple dose of nos in this movie. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. As part of my Fast and Furious franchise review series, today I'm going to be talking about the 2006 action racing sequel, The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift stars Lucas Black, Kang, and Bow Wow, and was directed by Justin Lin. It tells the story of high school student Sean Boswell, played by Lucas Black, who after being sent to live with his father in Tokyo, gets involved with the street racing and drifting community. Tokyo Drift was the black sheep of the Fast and Furious franchise for a very long time. I would argue that it's still the outlier of the franchise, despite its retroactive story tie-in, but it's pretty amazing just how loosely connected it was at the time of release. Unlike with the first two films, I do remember a time before Tokyo Drift got folded into the overall story. In fact, this third film in the franchise has the dubious honor of being my first Fast and Furious experience. I didn't see it in theaters, but I did watch it on DVD a few years later with my roommates during college, and I'll be honest that it kind of put me off the franchise for a little while. Even when I did finally start watching the others, this one remained at the bottom of the barrel for me, though I have to admit it has started to grow on me a bit over the years. Obviously, the context of the story has changed since the release of Fast and Furious 6, which I'll talk about a little later, but I want to first approach this review without all of those retroactive changes. I want to talk about this movie as it stood at the time of release, with only the two previous films coming before it. And in that context, this is such a strange movie. Too Fast, Too Furious felt like an odd sequel with its very minimal connection to the first film, but at least it had Brian O'Connor and made reference to events of that first film. With the exception of a very brief cameo, at the time of release, Tokyo Drift had absolutely no connection to the rest of the franchise. The characters, the setting, the story, everything was different. So, at the time, it was really only a sequel in name alone. Much like Too Fast, Too Furious, if this film had come out today, it probably would have been labeled a spin-off rather than an official franchise sequel. The story here is just so different than any other movie in the franchise. Even though cars were still central here, I think this film was targeting a very different demographic, really honing in on teenage boys rather than a slightly older male audience. Because aside from the car and racing aspects, Tokyo Drift has a very generic high school drama storyline. Because of that story, and the fact that it focused on very young, supposedly teenage characters, it all feels a little juvenilely simplistic and inconsequential, even when compared to its two predecessors. Again, great for that high school demographic, but very different from all the other films in the franchise. Although we're used to the globetrotting nature of this franchise now, Tokyo Drift was the first of the films to take us out of the US, and it really played that aspect up. Between the fish-out-of-water culture shock elements of the storyline, the visual aesthetic, and the drifting subculture, this movie really tries to make everything as cool as possible, and only succeeds some of the time. The whole Yakuza thing feels really random, especially when paired up with this high school drama stuff, but at least this weird plot confluence introduces us to the character of Han, who is easily the best thing about this movie. His role here doesn't make a ton of sense without the retroactive stuff we learn in the later films, but even so, he's definitely the most interesting and charismatic character, with his very laid-back yet wise personality. Even without any obvious contemporaneous story connection to the rest of the franchise, this movie did have one thing that made it clear it was a Fast and Furious movie: the racing. In fact, I would argue that of all of the films in this franchise, this is the most racing-centric movie. All of the films have car chases at least, and the early movies definitely tapped into racing at points, but usually those races were kinda secondary story beats, with the main focus being on some other sort of car-related criminal activity. Here, it's kind of the opposite. There are some criminal things with the Yakuza stuff, but the story is actually about racing, and the plot's driven, no pun intended, by these races. And I gotta say, purely focusing on the racing stuff, I do think this movie improves upon its predecessors. The drifting admittedly gets a little silly after a while, but it does look cool, and the CGI, while still noticeable, is not nearly as goofy looking as it had been in the past. Tokyo Drift on its own is not the best. The story's pretty lackluster, most of the characters are kinda dull, it's far too humorless for how nonsensical it gets, so I totally get why people hate this one, and why I used to almost hate it too. It was the sore thumb of the franchise. But I have to say, the retroactive connections and tie-ins to the rest of the franchise significantly improved this one. I think it's pretty clever what they did with the franchise timeline to make this film work. They took a movie that had no connection to anything else and managed to write a sequence of movies that somehow brought the whole arc together in a reasonable way. Reasonable for Fast and Furious, of course, but it's kinda weirdly impressive. So even though Han's role in this movie doesn't make a ton of sense, and he's a very mysterious character, we got 3 films of retroactive character development before the story finally loops back around at the very end of Fast and Furious 6. So rewatching Tokyo Drift after all of that, you get a lot more appreciation for the character and story, knowing the impact it has on the franchise from Furious 7 onward. It doesn't completely redeem this movie, but it does do a great job of tying it all together. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is definitely Han, and the reason is kinda twofold. Solely focusing in on this movie, he's definitely the most interesting character. He's kinda mysterious, and it certainly makes very little sense that he would get involved with the high school drama stuff or get as invested in Sean as he does, but he's still a very cool character as a result. He's extremely laid back and almost always seems to be boredly eating something, but he's also got this kind of strange wisdom to him. And that ties into the second part of the reasoning for this pro, which is all of the retroactive stuff from later in the franchise. Cause Han is that link between Tokyo Drift and the rest of the story, and the things that we learn in those other movies make him an even better character in this film. On the con side, the biggest issue has gotta be the story. It's really not good. The plot's super generic, even for a Fast and Furious movie, and has this strange reliance on very teen-oriented storylines. Maybe it wouldn't have seemed as bad if it was just a standalone movie, but the connection to the Fast and Furious franchise somehow makes it seem worse. So you've got this kinda lame high school drama thing, but then it gets wrapped up into this Yakuza light storyline too, and it just really doesn't mesh well or make all that much sense. The second con is the characters. Aside from Han, of course. Brian O'Connor was never the most charismatic or believable lead character, but Sean Boswell is somehow even less so. He's just such a ridiculous character, but not in the fun, Fast and Furious kind of way. More like the dull, what is this 30-year-old looking guy doing in high school kind of way. The other high school characters aren't any better, and then we've got the Yakuza or Yakuza-connected characters, and they're just as unconvincing, dull, silly. It's hard to explain. There's just something about the family aspect of the core Fast and Furious characters that make them more tolerable than the ones here. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying the Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give the Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift 2.5 out of 5 paws. The story's pretty awful on its own, but the action's sorta cool, and the retroactive incorporation of the story into the franchise helps a lot. This is one that's definitely grown on me some, but I still think it's easily the weakest in the franchise. I would recommend the Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift to people who like car racing or kinda cool looking racing movies, but don't really care about the plot too much. If you're just in it for some modicum of dumb entertainment, you might like this one. If you're hoping for some satisfying continuation of the Fast and Furious franchise, this film alone will be a disappointment to you. But if you like this franchise and have gotten to Fast and Furious 6 and Furious 7, this one does become semi-satisfying at that point. If you like the Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, I would recommend Furious 7. It might seem weird to jump from the 3rd film to the 7th, but this is where everything finally comes together. I mean, technically the link happens at the very end of Fast and Furious 6, but Furious 7 is where Tokyo Drift characters besides Han get wrapped into the fold, and Furious 7 takes place immediately after the events of Tokyo Drift. If you like the spin-off, sort of unrelated nature of this movie and want another similar Fast and Furious film, you should try Too Fast, Too Furious. It's got a little more of a connection with the return of Brian O'Connor, but it's still the other biggest outlier in the franchise after Tokyo Drift. And if you like the high school transplant storyline, I've got a probably seemingly strange recommendation for you. Johnny Tsunami. It's a Disney Channel original movie about snowboarding, but the basic story is remarkably similar. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen the Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, which movie do you think is the biggest outlier in any franchise? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.